next speaker, Professor Mary Zhang. Mary is the director for the Center of Women's Developmental Study. Mary is a leading feminist theorist. Her work has been very influential in challenging the existing way of doing modes of thinking, but also reorienting new possibilities. Mary.
Well, thank you. Before I begin, I really want to thank the organizers for inviting me here, though I feel I have many old friends in this room and in IACS. This is, in fact, the first opportunity I've had to be part of a conference, and I'm enjoying myself hugely. Particularly want to thank, therefore, Chua Beng Huat and Daniel Go, though I'm not sure where they are. I think I see Daniel. But also Kwan Singh and Megan Morris and the organizers of this panel, about which I'm hearing for the first time. In other words, I'm not entirely sure what my credentials are for being part of this panel, and I think you will see the problem as we go along. At the same time, I think I'm grateful at this point for having been forced, as it were, to speak on a subject that has been somewhat, I should say, tangential to my concerns in my recent work around feminist issues. So I'm very much entering into a sort of preliminary set of reviews and questions around what I'm calling the emergency, democracy, and the state, India, 1975 to 77. Okay, just by way of a quick overview, since many of us may not be familiar with the bare bones of the Indian emergency, which we simply call the emergency, which was imposed by the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, in 1975, lifted barely 2 years later in 77 when she held general elections and was roundly defeated. It is characterized, as have, I think, many of the emergencies we've been talking about this morning, by the suspension of democratic rights guaranteed under the Indian Constitution, the imposition of censorship. Thousands were imprisoned, and many more had to go underground under the draconian law known as the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, or MISA. The emergency in India is also remembered for its so-called excesses, its abuses of power, which included sterilization camps under the family planning program, whereby even unmarried men at times were forced into undergoing vasectomies, as well as the slum demolition drives, which are particularly associated with the city of Delhi. And just by way of a coda, for those of us who may need to be reminded that though she was ousted in 77, Indira Gandhi returned to power via free and fair elections in 1980. Okay, I just thought I'd give you a few glimpses of the kind of media images that characterize that period. This is a remarkable photograph of Indira Gandhi, in which she's exhorting everyone to produce and be part of her socialist program, to be united and disciplined. To be Indian meant to buy Indian, and in this particular ad, we are told that large proportions of our products are exports to the most advanced parts of the world. This is one of my favorites. Amul is a milk cooperative, and one of its very common and loved ads are for Amul butter, which to this day adorn our newspapers. Here you have a direct comment on the emergency, okay, and an even more direct one, okay? All right. Okay, so what are my overall concerns? The common sense about the emergency in India is that it was an area, that it has become today an area of silence, one that we have largely forgotten as we go on with our contemporary worlds and or contemporary problems. In my and I want to emphasize this, my very preliminary entry into the literature on the emergency, I have discovered that it isn't exactly, of course, vastly understudied, but not exactly an area of silence, but one that I would characterize as one of remarkable divergence in terms of different scholarly interpretations. Of course, as all of us, I think, here, and I can sense the concern of this panel is to push our thinking around the emergency into an interrogation of democracy. Okay, so I have 4 perspectives that I wish to share with you that are coming out of this literature. The first asks what place, if any, does the Indian emergency have in post-independence history? The second asks what kind of quote-unquote critical event was it? The third asserts unambiguously that it was nothing less than a watershed in post-independence history from 1947 to the present. And the last, which I would like to just place sort of tentatively before you, is the possibility that the emergency could even be, horror of horrors, a progressive intervention. Okay, so the emergency in history. The first commentator, historian that I would like to bring before you is Ramchandra Guha, very well-known writer who wrote a tome, a 900-page tome called India After Gandhi, The History of the World's Largest Democracy. And this is taken from his this quotation. Throughout the 60 years since India became independent, there has been speculation about how long it would stay united or maintain the institutions and processes of democracy. So there's a sort of question. You know, we're interested in research agendas. There's a bit of a question lurking here, but that question is very, very quickly dispelled because he simply tells us that we, in fact, suffer from a rather deeper malaise of not really being particularly interested or not being able to appreciate the history of the nation state itself. Historians stop with independence, 1947, and since then there have been just sporadic studies of elections, and he also talks about anthropologists going to a village once in every 10 years. That's all we care to know, according to him. So this 900-page tome, in which a very small chapter of about 15 to 20 pages is entitled The Autumn of the Matriarch. That's the emergency. It was an individual aberration, nothing institutional about it. So what we have here is a more or less triumphalist account of democracy, Indian style, implying we are too large, we are too diverse. In fact, we are almost too unequal to be ever ruled in an authoritarian mode. And I'm not interested in whether this is more or less true. What does bother me is that it renders research agendas more or less superfluous. Another voice in terms of history, and this is Partho Chatterjee, probably the Partho Chatterjee that I at least was less familiar with. Some of his earliest writings, in fact, have been on the emergency. And he begins with this question, what for him at that time was the big question for the Indian nation state, to be able to produce capitalism under conditions of universal suffrage and electoral democracy, which is what we inherited thanks to the national movement at the time of independence. That's what we had. And according to him, there was no example anywhere in the world of that being deliverable. Certainly the British didn't do it that way. Certainly the Germans didn't do it that way. He then gives us, and I think this is interesting to think about, a certain idea about the nature of political rule in a third world nation like India, where no particular ruling force could contend for hegemony. He uses the term Caesarism, a term taken straight from Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks. And the term implies the capacity for a particular leader to appear neutral, to appear above the contending forces, in the Indian case, both urban and rural, between the center and the states, and being able, in this kind of a context, to appear to have a direct relationship with, quote-unquote, the people. This began with Nehru, according to him, and reached new heights with Indira Gandhi. According to him, then, the declaration of the emergency was an inherently unstable political arrangement, precisely because this brinkmanship, this capacity to play off a balance of forces and take the Caesarism forward, this very mechanism broke down under the conditions of the emergency. So he says he's not surprised that it came to a quote-unquote end as soon as it did. His own work, which then tries to, and there's very interesting writings that are actually trying to come to grips with the inherently crisis-ridden nature of the developmental state in this period, then sort of has this kind of unreflected on shift to governmentality. I think this is the Partho Chatterjee we all know, the politics of the governed under a neoliberal state. So the obvious question we want to ask him, or ask ourselves, is, has India then achieved what he thought was unprecedented, if not impossible? That is to say, deliver a certain version of capitalism with democracy. And what I just want to end in terms of his, ways of looking at the question is that while it certainly raises many questions for us in terms of thinking about, and I think this question has come up in the previous presentations as well, thinking about shifts and transformations in third world nations' histories, I think to me it raises even more interesting questions about the very critical vocabularies available for rendering these shifts intelligible. Okay, because I see him as shifting, sometimes without reflecting sufficiently on it, shifting his own vocabularies as he goes along. Okay, now just because of lack of time, the emergency as critical event. This is a term that comes from the work of Veena Das, who has used a certain kind of anthropological lens to look at contemporary critical events. Interestingly enough, in India, beginning with the partition, interestingly, the emergency does not figure anywhere in her list of the events she looks at. It's another anthropologist, Emma Tarlow, who tells us that she, quote-unquote, accidentally discovered the emergency during her recent ethnographic work in what turned out to be a resettlement colony. Why? Because the members of this colony and the files from the municipal offices showed that these very people were products of the emergency directly. They had been relocated forcibly, they had had to produce sterilization certificates and so on. So she produces for us a new, what she believes, and she's the one who believes that we have completely silenced and erased the emergency from our midst. She produces what she calls the people's version of the emergency. Neither the official statist version, nor what she also dismisses as the oppositional political version of its ending. And what is interesting to me is that as she sort of makes her way through the many interviews and encounters and demands from people to sort of relive and tell her what happened, why, and how they got their plots and what it felt like, and did they have to or not, did they escape the sterilization moment, and so on. What is interesting is that she finds herself having to counter a certain image of either people as the suffering people, people as the resistors. People become, in her account, the ultimate pragmatists, active victims. This was a critical event that produced active victims. And I think this resonates in some ways with, I think, what Hilma Farid was talking about. No transformation of political consciousness. Most surprising of all for her is the people eulogize Indira Gandhi. She's the greatest leader we ever had. Okay? How does she conclude? She concludes with the terms complexity and contradiction. Now, I'm as guilty as she is of using these words. I think we love these words. However, I began to think that we need to expunge them from our critical vocabularies. I am beginning to think that they may be a cop-out when things don't look the way we expect them to. We say complex, contradictory. Third perspective, where Emma Tarlow is very unclear about what to make of it all, we have Arvind Rajagopal, who is extremely unambiguous. It is nothing less than a watershed in the history of post-independence India since independence. It is the emergency, according to him, that enables a shift from state-led development to, ultimately, the contemporary neoliberal moment that we inhabit. And the key actor for him is what he calls the new Indian middle class. Okay? So whereas prior to the emergency, the key actor is the state, and the state's professed interest in the welfare of the poor, the new humble hero post-emergency is this class. It is this class that is being wooed by a new entrepreneurial class of capitalists. It is this class that has to be addressed by a very elaborate machinery for the production of consent. It's very interesting the way in which he believes that there is now a sort of second layer of the state that is not even visible as the state, which is all about producing a quasi-autonomous sphere of public opinion, which is directly about a real or imagined middle class, what they think or do not think. In other words, then we see, and of course, yes, there is also the before and after in such a narrative, which is the before of the emergency is a time when, the ethos of culture and politics is labor and production-centric, to the moment after, the moment we all know, marked by consumption, marked by cultural markers of identity and community. So you can see the extraordinary amount of stuff, as it were, that is being put together here in this very ambitious account, where it seems to me that the emergency then becomes a crucible of extraordinary proportions. One that, through its coercive apparatus as well as its capacity to release new forces, becomes this time within which all of this becomes negotiable, becomes transformable. Now, again, many questions we could ask him in terms of its ambitiousness, in terms of what exactly then we could make of this particular moment. But let me move on. The final perspective, if you like, which is the idea that the emergency time and the emergency state could even be, quote unquote, in certain senses, quote, progressive. One is, and I won't dwell on it here, we have Ashish Rajaraksha right in front of us, the new cinema of the 1970s, which brought to our generation the struggles of rural India in the mode of cinematic realism, owes its origins to the emergency. Okay, think about that. To me, as a historian of women's studies, even more amazing, if you like, is Veena Mazumdar, a founding figure for us. Her statement that women's studies was made possible by the emergency. How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, then I can't go into the details. It's a very fascinating, I wish I could go into the details of the history of the prehistory, if you like, which involves the UN Year for Women, the production of a very fascinating report called Towards Equality, just on the eve of the emergency. Emergency is declared. The next thing you know is you have a government sponsored, the first government social science sponsored form of research is, guess what, women's studies. And why? This is the sort of answer given by the secretary of the ICSSR. The political implications of such research will not be immediately understood by the powers that be. So here I'm trying to indicate to you this highly problematic moment. Women's studies not born in the mode of opposition, not born in the mode of resistance, born through open state support, okay, at the moment of the emergency. And this is just a cover for you of the Towards Equality report. Okay, so some questions, some concluding questions. We've talked about states of exception. It seems very easy in India to think of the emergency lasting barely 2 years as nothing but a state of exception. Rather than go down that road, let me just try and very preliminary open up a few questions here. The first set of questions around the emergency state and its quote-unquote others. And by others here, I don't mean distant others, I mean close relatives. The developmental state, the Leninist state, the Maoist state. And so my question to us is, why have these either never been on or why have they dropped off our agendas, when in fact such states have in fact characterized the histories of third world nations and certainly Asian nations for most of our quote-unquote independent periods. Big question, of course, is the emergency versus democracy. And to me, one of the most troubling aspects of all the accounts that we've been looking at so far is that we seem to be rehearsing this dyad one way or the other. And so to me, the most troubling question is, in India, are we then rehearsing our version, if you like, of the Cold War narrative? Okay, are we doing that too? And I'm thinking here of the important work of Kwan-Sing Chen, Wang Hui, who have in fact alerted us to the impossibility of working with such a dyad. Yet I do believe all of us, Partha Chatterjee included, work with it. And finally, whose emergency? Okay, much has been said about the fact that the worst abuses of power happened in the capital of Delhi, and therefore this was really not the national emergency, it was really the emergency of Delhi. There's something to that, or at least the emergency of North India. We have more or less permanent emergencies in significant states of our country, Kashmir, the North Indian states, which again, totally in congruence with what has been said before, completely normalized. Okay, so was it the exception of Delhi that got us all worked up? Okay, let me sign off with this image taken after the gang rape of December. The gang rape of December 16th of last year, I think, has been world news, so I don't need to go into the details of it. What shocked all of us, let me put it first. What amazed all of us, women's organizations in particular, who are very used to carrying out processions after processions when violence happens. It's us and a few friends that attend. And in this particular case, it began that way, but very soon it was overtaken by thousands upon thousands of protesters landing up in this area of Delhi called India Gate, which is right here. And you can see in the background the ministries as well as the president's estate right in the distance. So for 2 days, we had utterly peaceful protests. But clearly, the city-state, the chief minister in particular, Sheila Dikshit, did not share our amazement and happiness, with people saying, we want justice, we want freedom for women. And down came the threat in the form of Section 144. Section 144 of the Indian Penal Code means that it's unlawful for more than 10 people to assemble in a particular public place. So this was imposed. You can see some of the water cannons in the distance, and forcibly the entire protest was broken, and they had to move to another venue. Okay, so fine, we thought, okay, this is a temporary measure perhaps, but were shocked to discover a few weeks ago when another protest was held in the city of Delhi. This was by students of the University of Delhi protesting the way in which a 4-year undergraduate program has been, one would like to say forcibly, but it has been done through suitable academic councils, brought to bear into the new mode of education that is going to be begun in the coming academic year, 2013, without any due process, without any kind of prior discussion. When students wished to stage a protest in this area of India Gate and arrived at the scene, they were summarily arrested and jailed. Okay? So Section 144 seems to have become more or less permanent. So the question I want to leave you with is, if in this, largest democracy of the world, those citizens, that is to say, urban, middle-class Indians, by default, probably upper class, by default, probably heterosexual, in other words, the quintessential citizens of modern India, the ones who are most likely to take their fundamental rights for granted, what happens when it is very much this group that discovers that these fundamental rights do not exist? Thank you.